Is it possible to reform existing central banks? Or not as drastic as, and I'm sure you acknowledge that like abolish central banks, would be just absolutely monumental in terms of political change. Probably a crisis is needed to really precipitate that level of change. But how about reforming central banks, right? We've gone through reforms of a different kind that were basically, not democratic in nature. When the U.S. got off the gold standard, for instance, that was a massive reform of the Fed and the central banking system. No one asked the population about that. But could we reform central banks in the other direction, maybe limit their power in some way? And if so, do you have any like ideas or proposals for how we might do that?
Yes, I mean, there are intermediary steps beyond just putting in a controlled phase out of central banking. It was around the financial crisis when the Federal Reserve just began paying interest on reserves. So one step that we could take is we could return to a situation where banks are required to keep capital requirements held at the Federal Reserve, but they don't get interest on those. And so, this is essentially a subsidy of commercial banks that was put in place post financial crisis in order to help stabilize the banks to begin paying interest on required reserves, which we never did before, which is billions and billions of dollars every year being paid out to J.P. Morgan and Citigroup and Wells Fargo on behalf of the American people for basically keeping a small amount of money with the Federal Reserve. Why does the Federal Reserve need these reserves, right? I mean, Federal Reserve creates money. I mean, it's obviously a scam. So there are steps that we can take to make the banking system less offensive. But I think at the end of the day, the real issue is the control of money in private hands and in the banking cartel. And so I think that, that's just one example. I think, looking at how much money these banks are actually able to lever up and loan out, I think we could change leverage ratios. The argument against this, and this is what's going on right now with the Basel Accords, which they're called the Basel III Endgame or Basel. They don't want to call it, the BIS central bankers getting together and making the global rules, which is what it is. They all happen in Basel at the headquarters of the Bank for International Settlement. But the Bank for International Settlement, as I mentioned, its previous Nazi ties and different checkered history means that everything with the BIS is normally kept in the shadows, even though that's where the euro was created before the ECB came into existence. That's where all these financial regulatory standards happen. We had Powell and Lagarde talking in Sintra, Portugal the other week, but they don't talk about the fact that all the central bankers were essentially meeting in secret over the weekend at the Bank for International Settlements at their annual meeting. So all these global central bankers, they get together at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, and they decide exactly what they want to be doing. And then they go out and they sprinkle the jawboning and the fairy dust, and they act in coordinated ways. So, I mean, just shedding light on what the BIS activities are. When these bankers are meeting, why can't we know the attendance rosters? Why can't we be told what are the minutes of these meetings? Why can't there be a press conference after these bi-monthly meetings? For people who don't know, the central bank chiefs of the top 63 central banks in the world, every 2 months they go to Basel, Switzerland for this 2-day meeting. It's Powell, Lagarde, everybody, Canada, Saudi Arabia, PBOC.
Everybody in the West or the PBOC participates
everybody,
as well?
The top 63 central banks in the world. Mm-hmm. Russia was suspended after their invasion of Ukraine. Okay. So Russia no longer attends, but no, pretty much every single major central bank head goes there. And almost all of the time, it is the actual head. So once in a while, like Powell won't go because of another commitment or something, and it will just be like the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And this goes back to, these meetings have been going on for decades. So every 2 months, and you can go to like BIS.org or you could Google BIS bi-monthly meetings, and it will talk about, there's 3 meetings they have every 2 months. They have something called the ECC, which is the Executive Consultative Committee. And this is essentially the G20. It's the central bank chiefs of like the top 19 central banks in the world. And the U.S. has 2 people on that committee. interestingly, it's not just our chairman that's part of that committee, but it's also the president of the New York Fed. As I mentioned, you have to look at the reserve banks in the United States to understand the Federal Reserve System. And in that ECC, they essentially set the agenda for what their marching orders are going to be to the rest of the world central banks. They have a very posh dinner in the evening, on Sunday evening, on the 18th floor of the BIS headquarters, catered in a beautiful dining room designed by the same architects that did the Bird's Nest in China. And then on Monday, there's two meetings. The first one is called the GEM, the Global Economy Meeting, and that's where this agenda that was set by the ECC gets passed down to the second tier of banks. And it's like the next 20 banks get to attend that meeting. And the final tier, kind of the last 20 banks, they get to watch the GEM, but they don't get to vote or talk. And then once everything's kind of been coalesced, then they conclude the meeting with the AG, the All Governors meeting, where all 63 members get to attend and talk and discuss. But essentially, by that point, it's just a ratification of what's been decided in the ECC and the GEM. The current chairman of both of those committees is Jerome Powell.
Okay, so talk about this a little bit. So I guess like zooming out for a second, there is maybe some measure of decentralization. It's not as much as we would want, but if you had a bunch of different nation state entities with central banks, and they were all kind of operating like outside of a collusion type of scenario, just on their own, independently, with their own goals and objectives, at least across the different countries of the world that have central banks, you'd have some degree of decentralization. But what you're actually talking about here is almost like this elite group of global bankers, this cabal, organized in institutions like the BIS, which is the Bank for International Settlements. I think a lot of Bankless listeners they'll be familiar with ECB, or they'll be familiar with the Fed, less familiar with the BIS. Does the BIS really exert sort of monopolistic cabal type control? Or do each of the central banks just kind of have their own agenda? Like, what are really the power dynamics here, and what makes this institution nefarious in your mind, or potentially nefarious? What are the corruption vectors? What's their agenda?
Well, the BIS, they're the central bank for central banks. That's part of their mission statement. And what they do is, there's a few functions that they provide. One of them is like they play host to things like the Basel Accords and things of that nature. So banking regulation, global banking regulation. They also provide these bi-monthly meetings for the central bankers to essentially discuss monetary policy, and this is their view, in a very confidential environment where they don't have to worry about the press. They can speak freely. They can, get to know each other. There's a private golf course they have in Basel that's only for like BIS members, I guess. So they have this kind of country club, Vatican City type arrangement. BIS is sovereign ground. It cannot be invaded by anybody without permission, even Swiss authorities. It's got embassy-like status under an international treaty at The Hague. It pays no taxes. Its employees pay no taxes. Any actions taken by managers at the BIS are immune from prosecution. They have a level of like diplomatic immunity in their actions. There's all kinds of things that this organization has that most people have no idea it even exists. In your listeners, I'm sure there's a lot of people who say, no, I've heard of the BIS, but they might not be aware of all of what's going on with it. But in the general population, it's literally an organization that most people don't even know exists. You say to the average man on the street, have you ever heard of the Bank for International Settlements? They're going to say, hell no, I have no idea what that is, right? So this is a very important institution that completely acts in the shadows. And what happens, I believe, is, as I mentioned earlier, that the institutionalization of the financial system forces the hands of these people. So Powell comes in and he's got his American, agenda, right? What he wants and thinks is right there. But then he has a conversation with, say, the head of the Bank of England. And the Bank of England talks about, look, I'm going to have to lower interest rates because we don't do 30-year mortgages like you guys do in the U.S. In the U.K., everything's like a 3-year or 5-year fixed rate, and then it resets. And like we're going to have massive mortgage resets coming very soon in the U.K. And if we have our interest rates where they are, it's going to be a big trouble. And it's the same in a lot of economies. Something like a 30-year fixed mortgage is very rare. I think maybe Germany might have them, but like other countries, I think France, I think, Canada, like all these places, they're essentially like what we would call variable rate mortgages. So that all these foreign central banks are essentially saying in private, where they know they can speak freely, we got to cut rates, right? Inflation be damned. If we don't, we're gonna put our economies into a tailspin. But if we do that and you don't in the United States, what's going to happen? The interest rate differentials are going to start to drive capital. They're going to start to drain capital from our economies, and then they're going to go, into the U.S. economy. It's going to jack up the dollar in order to essentially meet other demands, because we use the dollar as reserve currency. We're going to have to begin selling dollar-denominated assets, treasury bonds. This is going to jack up yield. So in order for you, Powell, to protect the American economy, you're going to have to cut rates too, because we have to. And if we get too wide of a spread between, where the ECB and the BOE and the BOJ are at and their interest rates and what the Fed is at, it's going to cause all of these financial dislocations, and it's going to cause instability in the treasury market, which is also one of your mandates, along with employment and price stability. So you need to fulfill your congressional mandate by cutting rates, even if that could be inflationary. And I think that's what we're going to see Powell do in September, is he's going to cut rates because he can't, keep rates where they're at, as the rest of the major central banks are entering, and many already have cut rates, such as the ECB or Swiss National Bank.
So the BIS provides a platform for the coordination of all of the central banks and for the ability to act as one. But I want to ask the question here is like, what's wrong with that? Like, is there something necessarily wrong with that? Don't we want our those managing nation state level economies, the central bankers of the world, to coordinate when they do something, so we don't have bad ripple effects? Isn't this just a sign of cooperation and everyone getting along? I mean, imagine a different scenario where you had like a World War III and none of the various central bankers were like meeting at all, and you like not coordinating because their countries were at war with one another. Is that sort of a scenario that we want? I guess the question is, does the act of cooperating or coordinating, does that necessarily lead to nefarious outcomes, or like what are the problems of this?
I think in the short term, it leads to beneficial outcomes, so that if people just were not coordinating and we had like the scenario I just laid out play out with uncoordinated moves, it would be detrimental to the financial system. It would begin to cause volatility. It would begin to hurt the stock markets. These would then lead to recessions. Recessions would lead to layoffs. People would begin to lose their jobs. And so this just begins, but in a way, it's the same thing, to take it back to a drug analogy. It's like, you take heroin away from the heroin addict. There's a lot of bad outcomes that happen, and that a different type of a drug that might simulate heroin can help. Giving them heroin can help, so that these negative initial effects are not felt. And what we keep doing is we keep doing things that forestall a fundamental reshaping that, as I mentioned, would be beneficial to the American people, because what we would be doing in essence is beginning the process of cutting out this middleman of the central bank. And this is kind of the financialization of the world. So, I mean, you can just look at, for example, the United States, and how much of our GDP at one point in time came from things like manufacturing and production, and how much of it now comes from, finance and these types of aspects. And so the world would have a richer supply of goods and services, which would be deflationary, right? The real impulse of technology and progress is deflationary. But through the fiat money printing system, we oppress that initial and primary deflationary impulse with an inflationary impulse. And an inflationary impulse benefits debtors, right? I mean, creditors get hurt in inflation, debtors benefit. And so we're perpetuating a system which benefits debtors. And the largest debtors are, of course, corporations and governments. And so we're helping out the debting system by perpetuating this inflationary system. And in the short term, we need this coordination to stop it all from unraveling. And that's why I say, if we were to move away from this system, it needs to be done, gingerly and well telegraphed. And it's still probably going to have some painful aspects to it. But in the long run, it puts us on, I believe, a more solid footing for growth and for actual deflationary aspects, positive deflationary aspects, which most people have a hard time comprehending, but it's basically turning the whole world on its head. And just imagine if we lived in a deflationary world, what that does. In the idea is that it would kill growth, but it would not necessarily kill real growth. It would essentially stop this tax on money that happens perpetually.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.